most of you know that already. Welcome to Abraham's Whiteboard on Black Muslims and the War on Drugs. And Dr. Alaina Morgan here will actually be bringing up a lot more than I know about this topic, but I'm very excited for this. Abraham's Whiteboard is a program series that has either guests or staff teach around a variety of topics that are really important to religious diversity and our communities in different ways. But every month we do something a little bit different. And definitely keep an eye out for the other programs that are coming up. But otherwise, I think we'll keep my intro pretty short and sweet. And I would love if you would be open to introducing yourself, Dr. Morgan. And then, yeah, just take it away.
Okay, awesome. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, all right, great. So my name is Alaina Morgan. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Southern California. And I teach broadly on race in America, on Islam in America. My research is, so I received my PhD in history of the African diaspora. So I'm really interested in, I'm an intellectual and political historian. So I'm really interested in the ways that people develop communities across international borders, right? Like how ideas and people travel across borders and how these ideas are really kind of, how these ideas change when they get into different places. And so more specifically, I'm really interested in the ways that Islam serves as the basis and the catalyst for a lot of freedom movements and freedom activities in the contemporary Atlantic world, so meaning after the Second World War. And so I am going to give this talk today about Black Muslims and the war on drugs. And I became interested in this topic when I was first doing my dissertation, and I realized that there's been in recent, when I was in graduate school, there was virtually no research by historians on the war on drugs, right? Historians are always so super late to the game. Like we have to wait for everybody to kind of be dead before we do anything. But now there's so much, right? There's so many people, right, that are writing about it. And I think 40 years now after the war on drugs, most scholars and policymakers really have identified the war on drugs as a failure, right? It didn't stop drug use and abuse. It didn't stop access to drugs. And it really just kind of created the catalyst for what was an exponential increase in the prison population. The prison population, right? The parole population, the populations, right, under surveillance. So I became interested, right, in this period. And the scholarship that was coming out at the time was really kind of about, right, all of these negative effects in the Black community, of which I will talk about today. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the way that some of these populations were pushing back against some of these negative effects, how they were trying to affect their own environment. And so how did, right, they understand the environment that they were in, and what are the kinds of things that they did to improve it, right? And so I look not only kind of at the realm of dreams, but also, right, at the realm of kind of putting these things into action. And I'm trying to kind of look at ordinary people as, right, like carriers of intellectual traditions as well. Right, so the state that we're in right now, so between 1982 and 2008, the US federal prison population grew from about 200,000 to 1.5 million people, right? And this is largely due to the war on drugs. As of 2019, it's beginning to very slowly decrease down to about 1.2 million, right? But the jails are still overflowing, and I will, kind of talk about how this was a very conscious decision by the federal government. Okay, so let me launch this PowerPoint. And I just want to say, right, like I love questions. I love being interrupted. It makes me feel really great. So that everybody's engaged, right? And they're like paying attention, and that I'm not just listening to myself talk. So, you know, if anybody has a question, has a comment, wants to ask something, please don't hesitate. I will just maybe ask Jeremy and Allie to please let me know if somebody has their hands up, because I am, despite using this platform for like 2 years, I still don't really know how to see everybody's hands in the chat, like while I have the PowerPoint on. So I'll just, all right. So I want to start here. Oops, here. This is Bedford Stuyvesant, New York, just a beautiful row, right, of brownstones, right? And I want to just tell you a little story, right? So for an entire month in early 1986, Talal Jabbar had been harassed by phone calls from his tenants about the intimidating drug dealers patrolling the premises and squatters taking up residence. Oh, you can only see presenter view. Shit. There's like a way to, hold on. My students showed me how to do this. Wait, let me see.
Sorry.
They showed me how to do it, and now of course I've forgotten. Okay, I'm just gonna do this, which is what I normally do when this happens, which is, hold on, view slideshow. I really don't.
It's not a big deal on our end. I just wanted to.
I mean, I don't. Yeah, this has happened before, so I don't exactly know how to fix it.
No worries. It's fine on our end.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of annoying, right? You can still just see the presenter view, or now you can't see anything.
Correct.
Now you can't see anything. Okay, great. Yeah, great. We're off to a great start. Okay, I think I have to go back here. Share screen.
There you go.
And you can still just see the presenter view.
Yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay. All right. I think it's okay. I think it's okay. I don't have, it's a little annoying, but oops. All right. Okay. All right. So we're back in Bed-Stuy, right? So so Talal Jabbar had been harassed by phone calls from his tenants about the intimidating drug dealers patrolling the premises and squatters taking up residence in his empty apartments, leaving browned crack pipes littering the hallways and common areas. Jabbar was exhausted. He tried to do the right thing. He called the police repeatedly, but they didn't do anything. Finally, he went to his local imam, Siraj Wahaj, a former Nation of Islam Muslim and the leader of Jabbar's local mosque, Masjid al-Taqwa. Wahaj had a reputation for anti-drug activism, and he had just begun to offer a new service. Wahaj and 4 Muslim men showed up at Jabbar's apartment. Showed up at Jabbar's apartment. Showed up at Jabbar's apartment building, kicked in the doors of known drug dealers and squatters, brandished weapons, and menaced them. Wahaj told them to leave. The police were again called. but this time to arrest Wahaj, his conspirators, and Jabber for burglary, menacing, and possession of illegal weapons. At Jabber's arraignment in 1987, over 80 Black Muslims showed up to the courthouse, repeatedly chanting jihad, 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 and other phrases in Arabic upon his release. After their own arrest, Wahaj released a statement professing their the innocence of himself and his co-conspirators because of necessity. The criminal justice system was colluding in Wahaj's mind to provide a prosecutorial shield for a drug operation and was failing to protect the Black community. If the police wouldn't do their jobs, the Imam and his followers would. Wahaj framed his duty to evict these drug dealers in terms of his duty as a Muslim, engendered but welcome language to the Bed-Stuy community of the time. Wahaj said, quote, "The Quran says that men are protectors of the women and that you help your brother who is oppressed. This jihad against drugs was a religious imperative." These efforts did not fall on deaf ears, right, or blind eyes, I guess. In the American Black community, Wahaj was praised by other Muslim leaders, most notably Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who applauded his former co-sectist, I guess, right, for his efforts. Nation of Islam Muslims living in cities all across the United States had been experiencing a similar phenomenon. They felt as if they were waging a war on two fronts. One against drugs, which were making their way into their communities, leaving widows, childless mothers, and orphans, leaving children neglected and abused, and women vulnerable to abuse by the police. The second, against the police and the criminal justice system, which had claimed they would do, which had not done what they claimed they would do since Nixon declared drugs public enemy number one in 1971. These Muslims saw the writing on the wall clearly. This was a setup. No help was coming to beleaguered Black communities. No mercy would be extended to addicts. Drugs would be allowed to proliferate because they provided a pretext for an invasion and occupation of the inner city. By 1986, Black residents in America's inner cities were uniformly experiencing what I and other academics like historian Donna Murch refer to as a crack crisis. At the time, a lot of people called what was happening in America's inner cities an epidemic, but I like to use the word crisis because I think that it really encapsulates the way that the Black community felt themselves about this and how it kind of created this spiral of impoverishment and incarceration, which took resources and people out of the Black community for decades to come. And let me just stop for a moment and ask, I know that, Tri-Faith is in Nebraska, but does anybody, right, like, and I don't know, right, the city conditions there, but does anybody remember, right, like the crack crisis, like the early war on drugs? And if so, right, like what is it that you remember? You can pop it in the chat if you don't want to say it out
loud. I'll go.
Okay.
So I'm a child of the 80s. I was born in 81. So I don't remember anything personally from when I was growing up, but I do remember that there was a lot of talk about it on certain TV shows and certain movies, like, late 80s, early 90s, like New Jack City is one that I'm thinking of. I actually just watched that last night. I love that movie. So I just remember hearing about it, I guess you could say, in like a pop culture context.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also a child of the 80s. Right. Right. Yes. just say no, right? Just say no to drugs, right? I remember the egg in the frying pan, right? Like, this is your brain on drugs. Okay. So I think that, right, like, so Reagan first declared, right, his war on drugs in 1982. He began to really propose the wide-scale regulatory changes that made up the war on drugs in 1981. Oh, right. So somebody says that there's a huge presence of the DARE program, right, in our schools, and actually DARE still exists right now, which I was like a little bit, I mean, I think the message is still like, kids don't do drugs, right? So I can see why DARE still exists. But I also remember, right, DARE, and I also remember, right, the pacts, right, that you would kind of sign that you were never going to do drugs, right, and all of these things. So I think it's very interesting, right, like particularly, I think it's interesting for those of us, right, like who were kind of born in the 80s, how there's so much, like, we remember all of these things, like pretty much the same things, right, like that are salient in our minds. I'm wondering for some of the people from like the older generations, if you would want to speak about it. Do you remember Reagan's kind of declaration of war on drugs? And, you know, at the time, did you think that it was warranted, right? Did you feel that there was an uptick in drug use and violence, or that there was a crisis, right, in 1981, 1982?
If I can talk?
Yeah.
Okay. Long story short is I'm from a very rural area of Nebraska. I don't live there now, but that's where I was in 1977. And I was fresh out of law school, particularly on Interstate 80. People were being pulled over and prosecuted in the county that I was in. I became a prosecutor in 79, and hook, line, and sinker, the litmus test for whether you were a good prosecutor is how you did on drugs. The drug has changed over the years. PCP, LSD, mushrooms were big at that time. Opiates at that time were not rural Nebraska, a rural area problem, or the middle of the United States problems. They were primary located in your East Coast, and came from a different source than what Oxycontin, which is the replacement for heroin. And through the years, all of the training was about being tough on drugs. And basically, in my opinion, the war on drugs, as I look back, was exaggerated. I stayed in the legal profession and primarily in close contact with criminal law until I realized that what I put people was responsible for putting people in prison for, our current presidents at that time were admitting doing when they were young. Mm-hmm. And it dawned on me that during my career, I had sought to have people put in prison for things now that the presidents who didn't get caught went on to be president, and the people who did get caught went on to a dead-end life in prison. And all for a war on drugs, which, by the way, we don't call it that anymore because we lost. And it at huge costs, not only to the Black community, and I do believe that the Black community and the Hispanic community particularly were impacted greater than those in the white community. And where I lived was primarily white, with some Hispanic and some Native American. But I believe that the reason for it, the reason that it became so crazy, just the fact that we declared war on our own people. Is there any other place where you call, when I was a little kid, okay, in the 50s, okay, that's how old I am, police officers were respected and they were to serve and protect. I watched over my career, it changed, and even their whole thing changed to a more militaristic, and this is in a rural area. I mean, and this is a nice rural area. It's not, I mean, these are, I have a lot of respect for these people. They try to be very good. But suddenly we were having SWAT teams in a town of 5,000. We were having military boots and dress and bulletproof vests and a very militant attitude and I knew these people well, a militant attitude that everybody could be the enemy, that we had to be prepared, we had to be fully armed at all times because anybody could be the enemy. And what that means, if anybody's the enemy, then we're all a suspect and we all can be shot. And it is a major, major change in cultural expectations, or what we expected of a police officer, what we wanted. And I've read some books about it lately, and some of it is that the war in Vietnam was over, and I think in the United States we were so used to being at war that we'd have a war on crime and we could lump it off, or war on drugs, and militarize our own police, which when you get to Black Lives Matter and you talk about systemic, I watched it change to a militaristic attitude, which is automatically going to be more violent.
Right. So, so we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah. So yes, there's a huge thing. Yeah. And yes, it was pressed in every place that those of us who were in the business, okay, we were trained to ask for the greatest degree, trained to prosecute. I mean, it was more important to prosecute in a lot of ways a drug dealer than a murderer. In a lot. I mean, that's where the pluses were.
Right.
So yes, you're right. It all started and it kept getting worse. And then we were going to save our kids and the red ribbons. And, at the time I believed that would help. Nothing else had. And so I spent my entire adult life fighting the war on drugs and finally realized, nobody announced it, but we lost the war.
Right. Yeah. As Ian, I'm sorry. Did somebody?
No, I just thank you very much for all that feedback there.
Right. So, I mean, as Ian said, right, this militarization and radicalization of the police force, right, is just a massive discussion, right, in and of itself. And we'll talk about it a little bit, right, like about how kind of the Nation of Islam in particular kind of saw this and kind of had like a counter response to it, right? Okay. So Reagan proposed the wide-scale regulatory changes that made up the war on drugs in 1981, and that included things like, right, getting ready to expand the prison system because of the anticipation, right, of the uptick of bodies. But he announced the war on drugs in October of 1982. Right, crack cocaine actually was not available until wasn't widely available until 1985, which was 3 years after the drug war was announced. Crack was introduced into the market in 1982 in response to a demand for smokable cocaine, right? Like powder cocaine is very expensive. Smokable cocaine is very, very cheap because it is it takes less of it to get high, and it is riddled, right, with all types of, baked with all kinds of impurities and things like that, right? But it wasn't widely available, and the authorities didn't have it on their radar, right? Effectively, there was no drug crisis when Reagan ascended to the presidency, but the carceral effects, the impoverishment from his administration's attacks on the welfare state, unemployment, right, in a legitimate sector, as opposed to needing to go to the black market, the illegal market, to make money, were caused by Reagan's war on drugs. And so in October of 1985, the Reagan administration starts a campaign targeting crack cocaine. And here is the excuse that they basically need, right, to reassert control over the inner city. And by 1986, Black communities, right, like Oaxaca's Muslims and Bedford-Stuyvesant, are kind of waking up to the realities of their occupation by police and all of these brutal effects of the drug in their communities. So crack was a really convenient excuse to continue the drug war, right, to justify the drug war. But that doesn't actually minimize the fact that crack was present in Black neighborhoods in the 1980s, right, starting in 1985. It was devastating, and it did cause a true crisis in the Black community on two levels. One, because of crack itself, because people are taking it, they're dying, right? There are brain effects, there are right, effects from neglect, right, of children, of all of these things, but also because of the sheer amount of people that find themselves swept up into the criminal justice system, right? Being imprisoned, you know, not only on occasion for life, but certainly, right, like for decades, and languishing in prison, which at this time, right, is also reeling from a comorbid epidemic of HIV and AIDS, which is not very well understood. And there are a few protections in education for prisoners about how to protect themselves, what this disease actually is, right? And if people get out of prison, right, they're bringing these things back into the community, right? So we just have like a crisis on so many levels. And just to kind of show you, this is from the Sentencing Project. It's a this is just a graph, right? And we can see right in 1982, the prison population had been steadily, right, like pretty much increasing, right, like since the late 1960s, just a little bit, right? And then all of a sudden in 1982, it like just goes completely off the rails, peaking in 2008-ish, right, which is where we get the 1.5 million kind of number, right? Right. So Oaxaca's example, right, kind of serves as the basis for what I'm going to talk about today, which was another highly publicized, much more national effort by Nation of Islam's leader, Louis Farrakhan. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about how Farrakhan developed his own anti-drug discourse, how he placed the invasion of the inner city from drugs and from police as part and parcel of the more international phenomenon of American neo-imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. And how, like Oaxaca, he wanted to do something about it, right? So I want to look at the intersections of religion and race, right? How Muslim identity becomes bound up in this war, in this jihad against drugs and the police, right? And all of the strategies they're trying to do about it. And, and so I'm interested not only, as I said, in the ways that these people are dreaming, but also in the ways that they are acting. How are they acting? How do the freedom dreams, the dreams from, right, like from drugs, from occupation, how do those translate into realities? And obviously, right, there are always contradictions, right, when we translate our dreams into reality. So here's my general outline, right, for the rest of the talk. So first I'm going to talk about the ways that these Muslims dealt with these issues in their newspaper, The Final Call. Then I will discuss, right, the ways that, given the realities of the crack crisis and the lack of police response, that Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam sought to take action through a program they called Dope Busters, actually named after the Ghostbusters movie of the time. And for all of you 80s babies, right? So, then I will end with how these events were expanded intellectually to be part of a larger system of American neocolonialism and imperialism on the part of the US government, and the subjugation of people of color, not only in the Black inner city, but also in the Americas as a whole, right? And so I'm gonna try to make this a lot more of a story about people than anything else. So somebody has a question about Malcolm X. So I'm not going to talk about Malcolm X now, because in the time period that I'm talking about, which is really right, like 1982 on, right, Malcolm X has already been deceased, right, for 20 years, and he's not really very much engaged by these particular, right, by the Nation of Islam at this time. There is kind of like a reconciliation with Malcolm more generally by Farrakhan, but he's not brought up like a ton, and so he doesn't really play into this particular narrative, but I'm happy to talk about him in another context. So, all right, so in August of 1986, right, okay, so now I'm on to the first part of my, of what I'm gonna talk about. All right, so in June 1986, Newsweek declared that there was this crack crisis, right, linked to an uptick in crime. And they declared, right, in their story on this, that this was a story that was going to be on par with Vietnam, with the fall of the Nixon presidency and the civil rights movement, right? So immediately we see the media kind of like pushing this narrative about crack cocaine and how dangerous it is, how it's immediately addictive, how it turns people like extremely violent, right? And there's also, from the beginning, right, this association with crack cocaine and with Black communities, right, which we then see, right, in as sentencing guidelines kind of warrant the unequal and uneven incarceration, right, of people that are convicted of powder cocaine violations versus crack cocaine. In August of 1986, just 2 months after this, the Nation of Islam's institutional newspaper, The Final Call, began to pick up stories centering the crack crisis. They were noting the drug was so powerful that it was ravaging the Black community and leaving, quote, twisted, dehydrated human frames in its wake. When The Final Call ran this story, written by journalist Lamont X. Curry, it published this public interest piece, basically this personal interest piece that centered the lives of 4 residents of Harlem, all who had had their lives ruined by crack, and 2 of those people, right, were able to be saved and to be redeemed by Islam. Right, so that article took Curry's readers on a visual and textual journey through the crack dens of Harlem. His guide was a man named Blondie. We learn that Blondie was a member of the Nation of Islam, but was kicked out for drug use. As the door creaks open, Blondie proudly introduces Curry and the freelance photographer, joining them as journalists from The Final Call. And he asserts his Muslim identity to the bouncer, even though he's been exiled. "I'm a Muslim," he says. "I was in the Nation and I'm going back." Although he claimed to be on the recovery from crack cocaine use, Blondie admitted that he still occasionally smoked a Wuda, a crack cocaine spiked marijuana joint. Blondie served several functions in Curry's article. He satisfied a voyeuristic and curiosity-driven need of the reader, but at the same time painted an incredibly humanizing picture of the crack crisis. He described the feeling of taking crack cocaine, but also emphasized the human toll that the drug was taking on the Black community in Harlem. He reported, "They find so many bodies on 144th Street, they don't even chalk around them anymore. X marks the spot and that's it. There were 28 bodies taken out of the church." Curry concludes his journey by recounting the experience of recovered addict and current Nation of Islam member Eugene 12X Butler. As he sat on the porch of an abandoned building on 148th Street, Eugene Butler's father weaved in and out of Curry's vision, turning rapidly in circles, high on crack, chasing what he described as an invisible cloud. Butler revealed that crack caused him to lose everything in his life. He confessed, "Crack did to me in 1 year what speedballs, heroin mixed with cocaine, couldn't do in 17. When I moved into this block, I had a wife, children, a Cadillac, a job. Crack took it all." Blondie and Butler's stories, instead of emphasizing the statistics and public policy implications of cocaine, focused on the lived experience of Black people in Harlem during the late 1980s. These stories are sensational, certainly, right? These images of people just turning like out of their minds, right? Like chasing a cloud, the idea that crack could cause you to lose everything, right, in your life, where even heroin and cocaine couldn't do that to you, right, in almost 2 decades. These are sensational, but they serve a different purpose in the mainstream media. They're meant to be, right, these cautionary tales. And they're also meant to set up a situation in which Islam becomes the solution to saving Black people from this scourge. By the end of the journey, Blondie and Butler still believe that the Nation of Islam had a critical role in tempering the scourge of crack cocaine. And both express in their own words the sentiment that in a little while, the only thing standing in America will be the Nation of Islam, because only Allah can deal with crack. And the story concludes with this hope brought by Islam. Both Butler and Blondie change their lives around. They make substantial steps toward recovery and building their lives. And we discover at the end of the article that Blondie is able to make amends with his wife and children. Butler moves to Long Island, he gets a new job, he regains custody of his children, right? And he's heading towards reconciling with his wife. And he reports, "Allah has blessed me, brother. He is ever merciful. I will have my new car in a minute. I'm working on a house and will soon get my wife. She'll make it all complete." Okay, so I see that there's a question. I just wanted to finish what I was saying. So it's Abu Bakar.
Yes. Hello. Yes, my name is Abu Bakar, and I wanted to say thank you to TriFit and Dr. Morgan for organizing this Zoom meeting, which is a very important topic. My question is, is there any reason or research that shows why the use of drugs was disproportionate, between the Black community versus white community and Hispanic community? I'm just trying to understand, if you look at the rate or, the demographic of, Black versus white or versus Hispanic, the use of the rate was super high, in the Black community versus, the other communities. So was it any particular reasons or, triggers that, you can address? Thank you.
Right. So this is a really important question, actually. So thank you so much, because there actually isn't any statistical difference in drug use in different communities. In fact, right, in the 1970s, when the 1970s into the early 1980s, right, when Nixon was saying that drugs were public enemy number one, and people were super scared about like heroin. The statistics actually were that heroin use in Black communities was lower than heroin use in suburban white communities, but urban Black communities were over policed, right? And so I think that the statistics tell us something, right? Like these statistics that I think that these statistics were large or really reveal a lot about motivations, right? By the 1980s, right, we know we've been like the civil rights movement, like it did its thing, right? Like we've had several Supreme Court cases. We know, right, that under the 14th Amendment, that you cannot have discriminatory language, right? Like in a, you cannot have discriminatory language, right, in the law. You cannot say something like, okay, we're going to over-police Black communities. That's what we're going to do. That's what we want to do. You have to use coded language, right? You have to implement a policy, right, of over surveillance. And then you have to make it seem like through these mainstream articles, right, that all of this drug use is all in the inner city and it has nothing to do, right, with suburban white people. And I think it was Chris that mentioned before, right, that when she was doing her prosecution, right, she's right, that there's a moment, right, I think probably with Bill Clinton, right, in the 1990s, where it's okay for him to brag about smoking marijuana, right, and he never goes to jail, right, but somebody, right, a kid off of the street, right, in Harlem, right, in Tulsa, whatever, is taken to jail, right, and loses, right, like their life and their ability, right, to make a living and all of these things. So I think that this is a really important point, right, that right, as Lachelle kind of says, right, Black Americans do drugs, right, at same rates or even lower rates, but they're more likely to get charged with possession, and it's because of the over surveillance of Black communities that comes into play during the war on drugs. During this time, we also see, right, like this rise in what's called broken windows policing, right? So people think, okay, well, we've got to keep neighborhoods orderly. We have to prevent disorder. And it involves a lot more foot patrols, a lot more seize, stop and search, a lot more random seizures, right? And the Supreme Court upholds this. And surely if you're like searching at like a quarter of the people in a neighborhood, you're going to find something, right? Like you're inevitably going to find something, right? And then that serves as kind of proof for it serves, right, as proof that this is a good policy, right? Okay, so Ian says, look at the percentage of Black Americans versus white Americans who are charged, prosecuted, and jailed for possession, right? It's a staggering comparison. And even when arrested, right, oftentimes, right, at least white people with money, right, are able to get themselves out of doing excessive jail time. Whereas, right, Black Americans are often, especially those from like poor backgrounds, are like goaded into taking these plea deals that end up following them, marking them, right, for life. Okay. So, so throughout this crack crisis, right, the Nation of Islam had repeated the conspiracy theory, right, that crack was forced into the Black community in order to commit genocide against Black people. And for him, this genocidal intent was of a dual nature. First, crack itself was deadly. And second, this scourge gave federal and state authorities an excuse to kill, confine, and imprison Black people with impunity. For him, this conspiracy was deep and diabolical, and the only thing that could save the Black community was to turn to Islam, right? And so for him, this inner city is basically contaminated with un-Islamic practices. just like the world was before the dawn of Islam, right? And so through the knowledge of Islam and submission to Allah, this conspiracy would then be exposed and Black people would be saved, right? So the question is really, okay, how is he going to do this, right? So now I want to talk about the freedom of actions, right, of the Nation of Islam against drugs and the police, right? And so we went to bed, we were in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and now I want to go here, which is on the right, Mayfair Mansions in Northeast Washington, DC, which is now the home to 17 extremely expensive luxury condominiums. But back then was the first housing project to be privately developed and insured by the Federal Housing Administration. It was designed by African-American architect Albert Castle, developed with the encouragement of Eleanor Roosevelt, and built between 1942 and 1946, right? So this was intended to contain federally subsidized housing for African-American families, and it provided a really, really needed alternative to what was very shoddy, ramshackle, unsanitary, and extremely, extremely expensive housing for African Americans, even though it was substantially worse than what white residents were getting. It was much, much, much worse, right? So Black families are like clamoring to get into Mayfair Mansions, and they want to occupy this absolutely beautiful new state-of-the-art complex, right? But as the promises of suburban life and the federal programs that are available to veterans entice white families away from the inner city after the war, redlining and racially exclusionary covenants ghettoize African Americans in the inner city, right? Deindustrialization and disinvestment lead to urban decay. And at this time, residents are impoverished. So by 1988, this is particularly apparent, right? And the residents of Mayfair Mansions find themselves battling drug dealers on a daily basis. This isn't really surprising to them, though, right? Because they've come to the conclusion, right, as Farrakhan did, right, that the war on drugs is basically a farce. And it stands to reason then that it was not designed to help or rehabilitate the Black community, but instead to subject it to more suffering. And so in addition to exposing the actual harm the war on drugs would do, right, to the Black community, the Final Call, the Nation of Islam's newspaper, also kind of expressed how ineffective it was, right? That this siege was actually contributing to unemployment. It was actively contributing to unemployment, to poverty, to death, to alienation and marginalization of the Black community. But it was completely ineffective at stopping the sale, the use, or the distribution of drugs. And it did nothing to address the root causes of gang activity, right, and Black participation in the illicit drug economy. Drugs for them were an imperialist agent, right? And in the next section, I'll talk about how this is expanded further, right? And a tool of the colonizer that was meant to destroy the Black community. So in 1990, as three Nation of Islam members announced their candidacy for local government. And I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, right? But as they announced their candidacy, they stood in front of like a wall-sized report card that basically rated then President George W. Bush's drug czar, who was former Education Secretary William Bennett. There were several categories, right? Efficacy, logic, etc. In every single category, Bennett was given a big fat F, except for one category, rhetoric, on which he received a mark of I, or incoherent. And so it was in response to these frustrations, reflected by this report card that I talked about, the failure of all of these, the failure of the of the government, right, on all of the counts, right, of the drug war, that the Nation of Islam's Dope Busters program was born in April of 1988. This was directly modeled on Siraj Wahhaj's drug patrols. And the Nation of Islam mobilized both Muslim and non-Muslim men to patrol the grounds of several housing complexes in the DC area, not only Mayfair Mansions, but other housing complexes as well, including one called Paradise, which was far from paradise at that time. So the name is actually very ironic, and they talk a lot about how it's not at all paradise, right? And they have to kind of return it to that. By the late 1980s and early 90s, as conditions failed to improve in Black urban communities throughout the US, the Nation of Islam expands the Dope Busters program first into Baltimore, neighboring Baltimore, and then into Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and New York. And they use, like Wahhaj does, intimidation tactics and violence from discouraging drug dealers from entering the grounds of the complexes that they patrol. Almost immediately in 1988, when they first start these patrols, they're embroiled in controversy because they assault this man who pulls a sawed-off shotgun, a sawed-off shotgun on the camera crew that was kind of recording these events. And this resulted in largely negative initial media attention. News reports throughout the country focus on the physical assault. Editorials in mainstream publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Sun-Times reflect on the incident and express the opinion that even though these patrols appeared successful, that they amounted to nothing more than vigilantism. And one editorial cautioned that because these men were empowered to do things that the Constitution and the laws do not permit police to do, that it was a slippery slope before the civil rights of drug pushers were encroached upon. But despite these negative reports, the Nation of Islam maintained that the program had made really quick progress in reducing the visible presence of drug-related activity at Mayfair Mansions. You know, it's hard to determine whether or not these claims are actually empirically true, because much of the press is either the Nation of Islam kind of saying like, yeah, this was great, like we did so much, we really kicked these guys out, right? Or it's the mainstream media being very anxious about these Black men who are willing to use violence, right, in order to clean up their communities. And kind of critiquing them for the use of vigilante violence, right? So it's hard to determine actually like whether the claims are empirically true, but I think that the excitement, right, that they kind of reflected about what they were doing, right, is significant in and of itself. So, right, and some of the testimonials by some individuals, right, that were interviewed for any of these publications, yeah, it's a little column A, a little column B, it's both, right, like, some individuals, right, who were interviewed for all of these publications, no matter who is publishing them, Nation of Islam, national, international, right, they do indicate at least some people do have positive responses, right, to the presence of these dope busters immediately after they begin their patrols, right? And so, for example, there was an interview in Time magazine where Glenn French, the property manager of Mayfair Mansions, indicated that he was absolutely delighted by the dope busters and said that their presence had caused something good to happen here. Community politicians and non-Muslim religious leaders also thanked them, applauding their efforts to stabilize the community. Right, and kind of shrugged off the initial altercation, blaming really the incident on the guy that drew the gun, right? Saying things like, right, like a shotgun is the violence, right? So once you draw the shotgun, what are you supposed to do about that, right? Like the violence has already started. So this is only one aspect of the Dope Busters effort. From the beginning, right, the Nation of Islam recognizes that drug dealers and traffickers were simply supplying, right, a product in relation to the community's demands. And so in order to truly eradicate drugs from the community's appetite for illegal drugs had to be addressed. And that included addressing what they called a spiritual sickening. Part of the project was providing treatment and counseling services. And so in January 1989, Farrakhan held this press conference to announce that the Dope Busters would expand again to include a methadone-free drug rehabilitation facility. The clinic, named the Abundant Life Clinic, was introduced in response to a request by Muslims in the community for drug treatment for an afflicted community member. And it became a permanent fixture, right, at Mayfair Mansions, which would include not only medical withdrawal counseling, psychological therapy, and support. And although the program was, technically it was open to everybody, no matter what their religious affiliation was, but there almost certainly was like proselytization and attempts to kind of educate people that were participating in this, right, like in the Nation of Islam's key teachings, right? And in addition, right, they had this, what they called manhood and womanhood training, which I've never actually been able to find out exactly what that included, but based on what I know, right, I think that it probably reiterated the Nation of Islam's super gender teachings, right, and provided kind of this opportunity for Farrakhan to increase visibility and membership, right? So, I mean, we can talk about that a little bit if people want to as well, right? So this is really kind of envisioned to lie at the intersection of religious duty and military mobilization. It's a counter-military exercise and a jihad against drugs to the colonizer. And the discipline of the state, right, as my colleague, historian Garrett Felber argues, that was accomplished by the Nation of Islam's own discipline. So this is basically what the Dope Busters looks like. This is fruit of Islam, young fruit of Islam, right? They're dressed, right, like uniformly militarily, and you know, they're not carrying guns, they're carrying walkie-talkies, but they still train, right, as a paramilitary force. They do a lot of martial arts, right, and physical fitness, right, drills, those types of things. And so this discipline, right, is manifested, right, in this counter-militarization, which presents itself by first, right, the coordination through the Fruit of Islam, the paramilitary branch, where these men are looking and acting like soldiers, right? They've been training for this like their whole lives, basically, right? Like the day that they joined the Nation of Islam. Right, and they're, you know, kind of impeccably dressed in a bow tie, military style jacket, right, like embellished with kind of this symbol of their nation, the star and the crescent moon, right, the symbols of Islam. And as mentioned, right, like right, and right, and the Dope Busters headquarters, right, at Mayfair Mansions, actually this plaque adorned the office space, demarcating it specifically as officers' quarters. And at the top of the complex, there was a Nation of Islam flag that flew that bore the star and the crescent moon. So they very much stylized themselves, right, in a military sense. And second, right, the Nation of Islam often symbolically reinforced the association between their drug busting activities and a religious military expedition, right? The very first time that the Dope Busters have a rally in 1988, a brass band plays Battle Hymn of the Republic. And the song is really meant to position the activities of the Fruit of Islam, of the Dope Busters, as serving their nation and their God. And then third, right, the language that the Nation of Islam uses to describe the environment into which they're intervening often uses the language of war, of violence, and of battle, right? And so in an article kind of describing the successes of the program, a Final Call journalist described Mayfair Mansions before the Joe Buster's intervention as a war zone, complete with nightly and daily gun battles, right? So we see, right, that this is a counter, this is a war on drugs, right, that the government has launched, in their mind, really a war on Black people, and they're doing a counter militarization. And so throughout the Joe Buster's program, Farrakhan and other Joe Buster's officials were like really compelled, said that they were compelled to enter into this counter militarization, this jihad, because of their faith, right? All right, so this is the last section. Okay, sorry, this guy is he's very needy, and he so the last section, right, which is about how they're thinking about this in terms of like a larger international, right, global sense, right? So throughout the 1980s, as they're reporting on, you know, these articles which make connections between the occupation of the inner city, what that they're talking about, right? Like the war on drugs, they're making connections between this occupation of the inner city and American imperialism abroad, right? And so both the United States occupation of Grenada in 1983 and invasion of Nicaragua in 1989 are both heavily engaged. But it's mostly, right, their focus on Panama, which allows them to expose kind of direct links between American imperial expansion abroad and the militarization of the police in America's inner cities. And so just a little like on the Panama thing for people that don't know about it, right? As the 1980s kind of comes to a close, so for decades, President Reagan had this relationship with Panamanian strongman General Manuel Noriega. And so as the 80s come to a close, Reagan reconsiders the relationship that he had developed with Noriega. And Noriega was really useful throughout the decade because he had assisted American efforts to undermine the Nicaraguan, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas by providing the Contras with arms and providing intelligence to the United States. So this is the Iran-Contra affair, right, that happens. The intelligence, right, but this intelligence is so valuable that the Reagan administration just really kind of decides to ignore his relationship with the Medellin family drug cartel and all of the drug funneling that he's actually doing on behalf of the Nicaraguan Contras. And this relationship continues despite the very clear ethical conflict between Reagan's war on drugs and Noriega's like illegal activities. But by the late 1980s, Noriega had just kind of become just too much of a liability, too much of an embarrassment to Reagan. And it became clear and public knowledge that Noriega was involved in international drug smuggling by 1986. Middle class protests in Panama against Noriega increases, and the Reagan administration thinks of this as a perfect opportunity to force him to resign through economic sanctions, right? And then by filing a series of indictments in federal court on drug charges. These don't really work, right? After Bush takes office, right, in January 1989, he spars with Noriega for months, right? Tensions are super high until a group of American soldiers are fired on by Panamanian defense forces in December 1989. And in response, Bush orders an invasion of the country on Christmas Eve, 1989. So in mid-1989, as tensions are escalating between Noriega and Bush, Farrakhan is making this connection between the global militarization of the police and the practical impact of the war on drugs in the Black community. Right, in June of 1989, right after the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, he recounted his experience watching the Chinese military use assault rifles and tanks to mow down young protesters, right? And during this speech, Farrakhan made a connection between the silencing of these protesters by military force and the United States government's attempts to control and silence Black youth in America. And speaking to Black youth leaders, Farrakhan warned the United States government was planning an assault on the Black community, specifically aimed at our youth. And again, right, the conspiracy is so deep and so diabolical that many of you will not even believe that at this very moment that I am talking to you, your lives hang in the balance. What we saw in China is to prepare for what you're going to see in the streets of America, right? And so in 1989, he's referencing this deep diabolical plot by the American government to use military force against Black youth. It's really easy to dismiss it, actually, right? Like as hyperbole, as conspiracy theory, as like, what does he really know about any of this? Interestingly enough, right, like what he's actually referencing is a recent mobilization of the US military, right, to assist local law enforcement in the federal government's growing national war on drugs. And in 1989, Congress earmarks $300 million of the defense budget to curtail the flow of illegal drugs into the US through surveillance and interdiction outside the country. March of 1989, they revisit the possibility of using active and abandoned military prisons for inmates convicted of drug crimes, citing overcrowding in civilian jails as the justification. So the war on drugs is working as far as they're concerned, right? Like all of the bodies that they anticipated filling these prisons are there now, and now they need more space. In March and April of 1989, the Department of Defense approved the release of $40 million in funds to National Guard militias across the US to assist local police departments. And so primarily, right, this is supposed to assist local law enforcement and surveillance and tracking drug smugglers, assisting customs officials with like searching containers and things like that, but also to lend equipment to local law enforcement, right? This is military grade equipment. These are helicopters, these are tanks, these are military grade arms, bulletproof vests, infrared goggles, right? All of these kinds of things. And so in January 1990, as discussions of allowing the National Guard to invade Brooklyn, New York, are taking place between then Governor Mario Cuomo and House Representative of Bedford-Stuyvesant, Major Owens, the Nation of Islam responds to the December 1989 invasion of Panama. And in January of 1990, they dedicate one front page headline, 3 articles, and 2 political cartoons just to the invasion alone. And it puts Panama in the center of America's lust for the growth of her empire, the control of her surrounding unaligned nations, and the oppression of Black people globally. And so in an article about how the US had dropped bombs on what they defined as the blackest neighborhood in Panama City, El Chorrillo, the Nation of Islam asserted that this was not just a war on the colonized, but a global war on Black people. More critically, right, this is a chain of events, right? So they depict, right, Reagan stepping from one place to another with a bush in combat boots. So from Grenada to Nicaragua to Panama. And then, right, so, and then in a political cartoon, right, they depict Presidents Reagan and Bush fused together as conjoined twins, representing Bush's continuation of Reagan's pro-imperialist policies. And then Reagan, with a smoking gun in his hand, places one foot in Grenada as he and Bush step together in Panama. Bush's foot hovered mid-step as the word next questioned where the next logical place American empire would next extend. So for the Nation of Islam, that wasn't what was logically next, was a invasion of the inner city that was justified by the war on drugs and assisted by this global expansion of the American military apparatus. And just as the United States had used drugs to demonize and remove Noriega in order to reassert imperial control over the Panama Canal, the war on drugs in the US was positioned just, as a farce, again, intended to cover the government's intention to kind of pacify and subjugate the Black community. And the Final Call editor defined this, right, as a Trojan horse, smuggling extra police officers, sheriffs, FBI agents, and soon National Guardsmen into the inner cities of America, resulting in legions of Black youth being locked up in America's prisons and jail. He then plainly stated, Panama was just practice for the real thing, urban warfare in the United States against Black people. So this is really inflammatory, but some of my colleagues, right, in the profession, and particularly my former classmate Stuart Schrader, has demonstrated, right, this is actually not, again, not an unsubstantiated conspiracy. Since World War II, American police had been used by security experts, by the US military and the State Department to maintain law and order and prevent the spread of communism, right? And this process necessarily reinforces American and imperial racial hierarchies. As these police and security officers kind of are circulating through their tours of duty, they then take those lessons on counterinsurgency home with them, right? And so this discourse about the Panama as practice round isn't conjecture, right? But it's just taking stock of the existing realities in order to promote, right, their particular message of social control, self-reliance, and Islamic religious rejection, right? All right, so that's all I have on that, but I want to tell you a little bit about what the Nation of Islam has been doing since then, particularly, right, like as the COVID pandemic kind of has been ravaging America, right, and particularly like in 2020, as we saw so many people, right, like take to the streets, and we saw kind of a new wave, we were seeing continued waves, right, of police brutality, right? So in the summer of 2020, as people took to the streets in sustained political demonstrations against police brutality and the murder of Black people, Farrakhan and the Final Call, which still exists, right, continued to build on this intervention that they brought to the fore in the 1980s. So in a June 9th, 2020 article, Nation of Islam journalists applauded the speed with which the protests forced Minneapolis officials to indict the 4 police officers involved in the brutal murder of George Floyd, and the commitment of the city council to defund and disband the city's police department, which ends up not happening, right? So we know this now, right? But they question the long-term efficacy of the protests, asking again, right, what's next? And so that echoes kind of these prescriptions of the past. The way through this dissatisfaction for them was to combine this grassroots protest and international politics with Islam, because justice for Black people could only be obtained through a dual engagement and political action from the grassroots, and with the internationalist engagement of all of the entire Black and brown world, right? A world that also experienced, right, the brunt of American imperialism and oppression. Right, but of course, right, the article doesn't miss the opportunity to promote the organization, right, and offer a very Nation of Islam specific religious solution. And so Ava Muhammad, who is the national representative to the Nation of Islam, right, and Louis Farrakhan basically said that this violence that was enacted on Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd has the Black community really looking for divine leadership, right, and of course that leadership comes from the Nation of Islam. And so I will, okay, so, well, I'll just say one more thing, right? And so so I've tried to focus, right, instead of focusing exclusively on like the destructive aspects of the crack crisis, right, and the war on drugs, I've tried to kind of talk a little bit about the Nation of Islam's anti-imperial drug discourse and anti-drug activism to suggest that there was a positive production of theoretical frameworks and active solutions, right? They positioned both crack cocaine and the expansion of the carceral state as a dual colonization and invasion, right? They understood this as part of a general American imperial expansion, and they understood their obligation to fight against it as Muslims, right? And they frame it in terms of their duty and their obligation to protect their community, their gender hierarchies, right? And to usher in like this new world order, inverting existing racial hierarchies, and Islam has a primary role. So anyway, that is it. Thank you guys so much for listening. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
We got a bunch of comments and questions in the chat.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Oh, you have a question, Jeremy.
Yeah, I did have, it's kind of two questions. Basically, if you'd be able to, I don't know, I guess broaden the nuance around Nation of Islam specifically, and its relationship with kind of what people would call mainstream Islam. I'm not really sure what the best terminology is for that, but you know what I'm asking.
Right, like Sunni Orthodox,
right,
like Islam. Yeah, it does get a really bad rap, right? Like it's separatist, it's very particularist, right? It has been, right, like historically very, very important, right, to the Black community, and it's also extremely important to a lot of people as like or had been, right, as an entry point into Islam, right, particularly, right, in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. So yeah, I mean, like Farrakhan is a nut. I mean, like, but I do think, and I think that what I don't see, right, like is any kind of active engagement between groups, right? So you don't see, for instance, Siraj Wahaja's Muslims in Bed-Stuy and the Nation of Islam, right, in Brooklyn getting together and like going on these drug patrols like together. I think that probably people could, right, join each other if they wanted to, right? But this is not like a publicized thing. I don't know if that is because it never actually happened, or because why would either one of those leaders want to kind of advertise, right, that their ranks had been kind of diluted by other Muslim groups. So you don't, but I mean, you do see, right, like this Dope Busters program, right, like I started with the example of Siraj Wahaj. It is absolutely like a copycat of his program. And so I think that, right, there is a lot of like general support, right, like for these types of programs, if not explicitly, right, then implicitly, right? What do they say? Like imitation is the highest form of flattery, right? And, you know, a recognition, right, that this is a strategy that works, in particular because it is a Islamically driven strategy. So directly, no, I don't see collaboration, and that makes sense to me because of how marginalized the Nation of Islam is, right? But I do see ideological collaboration between these groups, right? That they're both thinking about similar things, they're both concerned about certain similar things, right? And they are borrowing each other's tactics.
Thank you. Then we also have Ian's question here, kind of whether how to work with you know, is there intent? Was there particular intent of the war on drugs to prioritize attacking Black communities? Was it something that was misguided? Was it you know, cultural blindness? You know, where does this come from? You know, why did they push the war on drugs in this circumstance?
I mean, I think that from the So, right, in order to understand the war on drugs, we have to go back to kind of the war on poverty, right, of the Johnson administration. And, we have to understand the ways that like vice, criminality, poverty, right, like drug use, all of these things, these pathology, like essentially pathologies, right, like pathologize the Black community. With the Johnson administration, we also see, we start to see the beginnings of mass incarceration, particularly, right, like in a race blind kind of way directed toward the Black community, because we see such an uptick in the incarceration of civil rights activists, right? So we have a bunch of political prisoners kind of languishing around in prison because of their participation, right, in political actions, right, like in uprisings, right, that happened in 64 and 68, right, all of these things. And so, I think that, and then, right, like with Nixon, it doesn't say this like when he launches the war on drugs, but he like does actually explicitly say, right, that he is targeting, right, like these commies and Negroes and right, whatever. So, in terms of Reagan, I think that his policies were so demographically like specific, right? Like the gutting of the welfare state, right? The concentration of the war on drugs in the city as opposed to in the suburbs, right? I think that these are conscious decisions that are intended to continue to criminalize, right, Black people, but they're also very much built on understandings of Black criminality, and Black pathology, right, that had developed up until that point, right? Like Johnson's not the beginning of it, right? We see kind of these ideas of criminalization of Black people, starting like right in the 1920s, right? Even earlier, right? Like with the advent of scientific racism. So I think that it's these things, right? Like they're implicit, like almost. Like, is it cultural blindness?
More direct than that, but less direct than saying it, saying what
Right,
you're doing.
they're not saying it because you can't, right? Like, you could say it in a private discussion, but you can't put it into the legislation, right? Like that would be immediately struck down by this. I hope it would be immediately struck down by the Supreme Court, right? Who knows these days? But yeah.
That's super helpful. I think that kind of gives at least a framework to think about it some more. Abu Bakr was also wondering whether, well, actually, Abu Bakr, would you like to ask your own question there?
Sure. My question is, was there any attempt from the Nation of Islam leadership or, Siraj Wahab, to work with, the different administrations, either, with Reagan administration or, Bill Clinton administrations or any various administrations that were, portraying or, having, that notion to address drugs, was they, because, I see that, from throughout your presentation, it didn't seem like, they were working hands in hand. So not sure if there were any attempts or, the attempts were rejected or, if you can address that, please. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Not that I've seen, right? I think that the Nation of Islam tends to be pretty critical of every administration. Like I would be hard pressed to find like an article being like, this president is great, we're so happy about him, right? You do see much less vitriol directed toward, right, like Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. Like notably, right, there's like no critique of Carter ever, right? Like there really isn't any critique of Carter. But So no, not that I've seen. However, I think that something that might be right kind of interesting to note is that eventually, right, like so at first the police are extremely threatened by this, right? And even in Los Angeles, there's an incident where a bunch of Fruit of Islam who were kind of trying to patrol this very heavy, like I'm pretty sure it was Skid Row, although it does not say that it was Skid Row, right? Right, so they're basically trying to patrol Skid Row, like this area of prostitution and drug use, right? That they're talking about, and they get attacked by the LAPD. So there is a point at which the police are very threatened by what's happening. That goes away eventually. And soon, just like with Siraj Bahaj, actually, the police and these Muslims start to actually work together to try to figure out some of the best strategies. So, and that comes after, I think, the police kind of decide, you know what, these people are not really actually threatening to us, right, at all. And they're kind of like doing our jobs for us. So we might as well just like kind of work with them. So government administrations, like presidential administrations, no. Local government, yes, more so. There is an attempt to work on a local level, but just on a national level.
Great, thank you. Just a follow-up, if I may. You know, this may be a little bit different, but you know, with systematic racism and Nation of Islam, you know, are there, you know, also, you know, trying to address that, like, you know, they've tried to address your, you know, war on drugs, or, you know, you haven't had any insight on that? I just want to be, you know, educated regarding that as well. Thank you.
Right. So you're asking, like, besides the war on drugs, are there other attempts for them to address systematic racism?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, that's basically, I think that. I think that that's kind of their entire platform, really, right? Like, is kind of to figure out how it is to help Black people to succeed, be successful, thrive, right? Despite all of the barriers that are put up against them. And from the start, even from the 1960s, when the organization was under Elijah Muhammad, right? There's a recognition that, right, Black people have the deck stacked against them, right? That there are all of these different things that are coming from the times of slavery. Like, and one thing, right, like for them is diet, right? The way that there are food deserts, right? They're talking about food deserts in Black neighborhoods, like in the 60s, right? So, and a lot of activists, right, in the 70s begin to talk about it, but they're talking about the fact that this food is not available. Of course, it's a business strategy as well, because then they can put their own supermarket and tell everybody to go there, right? But at the same time, right, they do legitimately see this as providing a solution to something that systematically disadvantages Black people, which is poor nutrition, right? And then they link that to, this is why our kids are not doing well in school. This is why, right, like, we are not healthy and that we're dying faster than everybody else. And there's no education about it, right? So they're trying to give people education. So I think that the example of food is actually like a really strong example of how they're trying to attack systematic racism. And then it's more explicit than that too, right? They repeatedly, right, like, are trying to talk about, right, all of the systems, right, that are trying to keep Black people down, right, like the mortgage industry, the right, the war on drugs, all of these things. So yeah, so I think that if you look at the publications as a whole, or the discourse as a whole, you really do see right, an attention to systemic racism, and of course the solution, right, is Islam.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you. I think I mean, we're basically at the end of the time, and I think this has been really, really interesting, really helpful. I would love to make sure that everyone who has attended, check out the survey link. We would love to hear your feedback. But otherwise, I think this is kind of the end of the time. But thank you very much, Dr. Morgan, for being here and for teaching us a lot about these important issues.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I know it's late there, and yeah, thanks for sticking around. And this is really great. Thanks for all your questions and your comments and everything.
Thank you. Everybody have a good one.